Greetings. Good evening. Welcome to the gutter. Everyone ends up here eventually. It's only a matter of time. This week, there's a lot of things that I want to say, and you know I like my comics a little bit older. For those of you who are just tuning in, this may be your first time in the gutter, or maybe you've been ordered by a court to view material as a warning of what can directly result from your use of copious amounts of hallucinogenic drugs in your early 20s and the effect they have on the human mind. Welcome. I am Aldous, and I will be your host this evening. There will be no guest. This is more of a journey down comic history lane. Each episode of The Gutter is intended first and foremost to be entertaining. Secondly, it is my small, meager attempt to accomplish that which I would like to see. That being someone that has spent an inordinate amount of time learning facts about the great history of the medium of comics and make a complete ass out of himself while he does so. I feel I accomplished this in spades. All that being said, there is a dark cloud of censorship and authoritarian control over the distribution of comics at the very heart of this particular story I'm going to tell tonight. But as long as the written word has existed, so have those existed who wish to control both the dissemination of ideas as well as the presentation thereof. From outright bans to restrictions, even mass destruction of materials, history, even recent history, has shown that if anything holds true in any particular era's zeitgeist, it is that outrage will always be a double-sided coin that cuts for both advertisement as well as limitation of access. Historically, since this has always existed, the ebb and flow of a natural cycle has emerged. This is not what we, or I guess more appropriately tonight, I, will be discussing this evening. Instead of adding to the litany of terrible takes on whether the comics code was good or bad, we're talking about what resulted from it. The glorious unintended consequence of fate and talent merged with the complexity of a market that is always evolving and rarely understood, especially by those that always claim they do. Tonight, we will be discussing underground and independent comics of yore, specifically how they responded to the Comics Code Authority. And I'll probably be throwing in some little tidbits about a couple other mainstream companies as well. But first, let me greet my glorious, glorious chat. First viewer, Eric the Guapo joined us early. Yes, it is I. Thank you, Eric. It's always a pleasure to see you. Following him, Nicholas Greer. Howdy. Good to see you, Nick. And then we've got Odin Dasco. Odin Dasco obviously enjoyed his time so much in the gutter last week, he decided to return. Rounding it out, we have Arrogant Ape. He's here for some gutter butter. Well, if gutter butter are hard facts, then cheer on, my friend. You're going to enjoy this. So, as a further aside, I do want to make one small caveat. I've never liked blatant religion shoved in my face in any work that I read. No different than nudity or extreme violence or visceral horror done for pure shock value. That being said, I do agree with a fundamental moral code and feel that it should be adhered to when it comes to anything that children have ready access to, which is not excusing the parents' responsibility, which is first and foremost. So with that little caveat out of the way, let me dig in here to some meat. If ever there was an epoch moment within the realm of comic bookdom, if you will, if you could distill it down to any particular time, it would not be the first issue of Action Comics or the debut of the Fantastic Four. It wouldn't be when Jack Kirby decided he was going to draw panels on a page. It wouldn't be the early nascent comic strips by Hal Foster that Odin and I discussed on the show last week. It would, in fact, be September of 1954. For in that auspicious month, the 9th, for all the numerologists out there who factor deep causation into such coincidences, was when the Comics Code Authority was formed. And that was a response, or perhaps more appropriately labeled a reaction, to a series of United States Senate hearings addressing the ridiculous book Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wertham. The Comics Code was founded as an industry watchdog of sorts. It produced a list of 41 rules or regulations or guidelines, however you want to paraphrase it, that served as a guarantee of sorts for parents on what they could expect from any book that carried that label. Some publishers thrived beneath these rules. Others adapted by canceling titles and focusing on what was now only Comics Code approved titles. Others shuttered their doors completely. The impact of the rules and restrictions was just too much for their catalog to bear. In practice, if not reality, the cost of having CCA approved books was a lack of distribution by wholesalers, thus a lack of customers. You either played by the CCA rules and received access to their market, the market cultivated by years of everyone's distribution, habit buying, and association, or you lost access to that audience completely. You were a pariah. It wasn't the content that they were limiting to a very large degree. It was the access to the audience, a buying public, an audience that the larger publishers claimed for themselves and held on to with righteous, indignant fury. The market, I guess if we can take another aside, and maybe I should have called this show, here's an aside of an aside, but so if you subscribe to the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's school of thought, the market is a living entity that organically changes. Supply will always adapt to demand, and demand will always adjust accordingly with what the supply has offered. If you interfere with that system, there will be moments of tribulation and trial, but it will always reach out to a standard equilibrium. And so, William Gaines, the owner and publisher of EC Comics, after several massive and extremely heated disagreements with the CCA board, chose to move away from comics entirely, focusing on, of all things, Mad Magazine and a couple other periodicals that were out of their authority. So stepping back a bit, let's go 20 years prior to this, 20 years prior to September of 1954. We're going to go back into the early 30s real quick, because we do need to talk about what was going to be born out of the CCA, almost the bane of the CCA, if you will. And arguably, if you could source the underground comics movement that was born out of this, its sources to the early 30s to the early 50s in the Tijuana Bibles. Now, Tijuana Bibles were debaucherous works, often less than a modern ash can in length, tawdry affairs featuring popular cartoon characters, actors, and usually like more wholesome stuff that was done with lascivious and lewd acts and played hard into off-color jokes. They are often forgettable for their very content. They were illegally distributed, often in venues that extended even beyond the long arm of Johnny Law. And this is where also the CCA couldn't reach. If the CCA accomplished anything at all in those early days, it was taking these small footnotes into the scene and pushing them further into relevancy. So similar in style, if not general formulation to the Tijuana Bibles, was the emergence of the zine. While coming after the metamorphosis of sorts of these tawdry short books into something that was more widely distributable and accepted, this is where underground comics kind of found their infancy. And it was during the arguably, the street level was occurring almost immediately after the CCA was formed. But what you're starting to see with as far as underground comics infancy is going to be in the mid 60s to their heyday and to the mid 70s. And in many ways, that path that the previously mentioned Gaines took with Mad is it owes a lot to the stylings, if not the content, to those Tijuana Bibles and their shock value, if you will. And so that formerly mentioned Mad Magazine and Kurtzman's own and Harvey Kurtzman's own Help magazine both served as foundational launching points, arguably, for the entire underground movement. Not for the least of which was because these were paying gigs that these artists could get. And so, I mean, everybody's familiar for the most part with Mad Magazine. It's been around forever. I'm sure you've picked one up. Now, one thing that you might not be familiar with that I mentioned was Kurtzman's Help magazine. Help was something similar to Mad, but with a little bit of a stranger bent. It had small articles, but most of what it was just short comic strips. And these short comic strips pushed the limit whether it was political, whether it was sexual, whether it was drug use, any ill, quote unquote, that handled a moral society was addressed with a ribald flair. And the artists that worked on these were simply fantastic. They were those that thumbed their nose at doing anything with the CCA, those that refused to bend the knee, so to speak, to any rules or restrictions on both their art or where it could be distributed. And so what we have is, well, first let me talk a little bit. I guess let me talk a little, because I like to do this every once in a while. Going back to Help, Mad magazines vary in value all across the board. Help, you can get most of these issues for 10 to 30, depending on condition. There's a minor following in the collector market. It depends on what individual content is within each magazine. You kind of get fans of some of the guys I'm going to be mentioning that gravitate to one issue or another. But and one of those gentlemen that did some work in these magazines that has a significant following is Frank Stack. Frank Stack operated under the pseudonym of Fulbert Sturgeon. The other one that at this time was kind of very worthy of note was Gilbert Shelton. Both of these gentlemen produced some of the early underground works, especially after working with both Mad and Help in particular. Sturgeon's The Adventures of Jesus, which was tawdry in and of itself for a title, started in 1962. It was drawn and produced, drawn by hand, and copies were produced via photocopier or mimeograph machine into a zine of sorts by Shelton. And the line work's nothing to write home about. It's more the fact that why they were doing this. They were doing this because they loved the medium. And while you tend to get salvation or salacious content, it's simply because of really what was available. They were looking for a little bit of shock value because of how much they felt they were limited. Frank Stack also, if you ever get a chance, and we're going to talk a little bit about him later, but Stack, under his own name, would pen a personal homage to Robert Crumb in Monty Beauchamp's book, The Life and Times of R. Crumb, which was published in 1998. If there's any book that you take out of this, I highly recommend you read it. It's an excellent, excellent read. So another early foray into this underground scene was Jack Jackson, or known by Jackson, just Jaxon was kind of his pen name. And his particular book, God Knows, saw publication in 1964. Due to its formatting, its distribution style, how Jackson handled sales, many consider this to be the first, one of, if not the first, official quote unquote underground comic, which is such a ridiculous string of words that to be put together that it almost makes no sense in and of itself. Now, there's one gentleman that we do need to spend a little bit of time on as we go through this, and I'm laying out who these people are, and then we'll get to their motivations. And I think if you're going to introduce this guy, you just got to go with his own words.
I really felt that that's really where it was happening, as far as I was concerned. People like Stan Lee offered me series to do, comic series, and I've always had to turn them down because I really dig my own. I insist on having, first of all my own rights. I'm the only one who's ever been able to protect my rights was myself. Most artists, especially when I first met them, were selling all their rights in New York, all over the place, and to publishers who are very greedy monsters, and they take away everything if they could. But now things are changing in the last few years.
And that was Vaughn Bodie at the Toronto Art Festival in 1974, talking about his experiences in the early 60s. And Vaughn is notable for a number of reasons. more than likely if you're not familiar with Cheech Wizard, you're familiar with the influence that he played into more than likely in Ralph Bakshi's Wizards. But in 1963, Vaughn published Das Kampf. And Das Kampf was a send-up of Charles Schulz's Happiness is a Warm Puppy. It was just a bunch of individual pages that were kind of individual moments of a soldier with a witty line or a witty caption, and that's all it was. And he mimeographed out 300 copies and sold them. And to this day, if you have a first edition copy of Das Kampf, they are worth a fortune. Following Vaughn's death, his wife reprinted it in 1977, and those are fairly collectible, but they're valuable, but not exceptionally so. You can usually get them for under $100 in a decent enough condition. But Vaughn, and I see Arrogant Ape says he turned out he was a soothsayer. Vaughn did, and he talked a little bit about there at the end of that quote. Things are changing. That's in 1974, and he's saying things are changing. And sadly, he was right, but he wasn't right about when things changed, because shortly after that, as we'll get into, the underground kind of dies. But also in this same time period, you have Joel Beck's Berkeley Barb, and also Lenny of Laredo by Beck. Both of those were published in 1965. Again, using the term published loosely, these were loose leaf stapled, the crudest of crude bindings. Mimeograph / copy machines at this time were absolute garbage for repetition of quality. You're talking ink smudges, fingerprint smudges. If you didn't let the pages dry long enough, the ink would rub on the back of the pages. I mean, today, that's half the character of these books. If you could actually get your hands on one, they're fun, they're exciting, and they were raw. And that rawness, that excitement that was poured into this all stemmed from the fact that somebody said, no, you can't do this. If you do that, you're not allowed. And when you start saying that, very creative people get very offended and suddenly get very motivated. And so in 1966, arguably one of the three figureheads of American comics sees what's going on, because it's electric, man. It's in the space. Everybody in the scene can hear about what's going on, and some of these books are getting passed around. A lot of them aren't even being sold. They're being handed from person to person. Just for a lot of these artists and these creators, they're just looking for notoriety. They want somebody to resonate with what they are, because they can turn anywhere on the street, but they can't get anything they do on the newsstand because they don't abide by the CCA. They don't bend the knee. So in 1966, Wallace Wood, seeing an opportunity, would enter the proverbial underground with a small zine of his own, Wit's End. And of course, there's Wallace Wood, and then here is Wit's End. Now, Wit's End was published on an irregular, if not completely fucking erratic schedule. From 1966 until 1985, and either Wood or Bill Pearson headed up individual issues. I think Wally gave it up in the late 60s, early 70s, and Pearson handled it after that. And Wit's End directly gave the finger and kind of put an exclamation point on what all these guys in the underground were really trying to do. One, he brought immediate notoriety to any content that was in a magazine because it held his name. Everybody knew who Wally Wood was. At this time, Wally Wood's getting the highest page rate at Mad Magazine of anybody any traditional cartoonist in the nation. When he would eventually go to Marvel, he took a significant pay cut to draw that first Daredevil issue. He was getting paid around $200 a page in the late 60s, early 70s at Mad, and he got $75 a page at Marvel. But Stan was a convincing fella and told him he needed to come over. But all that being said, Wood established a firm no policy for Wit's End. He allowed artists to have a creative detour from any dour restrictions and opened them up to all possibilities. And during the same period, one of the editors that worked on this, Bill Spicer, proving, if not establishing, their importance in comics forever, well, at least anybody with beyond a third grade reading level, but began promoting terms like graphic novel, graphic storytelling, illustrated narratives. These are the first time these terms are heard anywhere. And it's, again, only from this underground scene. So by the end of the 60s, Wits End was being promoted, and I quote, as what Wood was looking for. Uh, Intended for fans and collectors of science fiction, comics, satire, sword and sorcery, and related fields with the best illustrators and artists. And that was not marketing. They can actually deliver on this. These are stated facts. The zine involved the talents of Frank Frazetta, Steve Ditko, Reed Crandall, Gil Kane, Jack Kirby, and Angelo Torres. It was a phenomenal magazine. The distribution off and on had more to do with workload on the part of the people that were heavily involved in it. So, and when we get to that distribution, how did they get these out? Earlier, I talked about they were handing them out and trying word of mouth. The underground press found ways to bypass any barrier that the establishment could put on them. Any alternative means of production and distribution. Newspapers and comic books could be printed in small runs. Even a 10,000 run was small at this time, and you could easily spread it through a network of interconnected businesses and street entrepreneurs. And you have to remember, a lot of this stuff, if you're caught with it or if you're caught selling it, is going to be determined lewd. So you're going to have obscenity charges if you've even got it in your possession. This is a different era for sure. But nobody in this network cared about the censorship. Before the CCA, none of this existed, or if it existed, it was in very small amounts. As soon as that hammer went down and said, you have to bend the knee, you have to follow these rules, that's when everything exploded. That's when everybody on this creative space went, no, I don't think I will. And so these are just a few of the responses in the 60s from the underground and the indie movements. But as I mentioned earlier, there are a few notable exceptions from the mainstream that are worthy of mentioning for quote unquote underground sensibilities in how their corporations responded to the CCA. And one of them was Dell Comics. Dell Comics are good comics was their slogan. And Dell Comics were good comics was not, well, realistically, it's not even really a slogan. It was their promise. It was their claim. It was their exclamation point on the end of their business marketing process to say that, hey, you're safe with Dell. And at this time, Dell was one of the largest comic book companies. They did a lot of licensed work for Disney. They claimed in their own advertisements in 1953 to be selling 26 million copies a month. I'm going to say that again, 26 million copies a month. And of course, I do need to make a couple of clarifications here as well. Dell, from 1938 to 1962, Dell Comics was not actually a comic book company. Dell actually cut a deal with Western Publishing, who did all the production of the comic books. Dell just financed it and distributed them. By 1962, Western kind of started realizing that, well, given the sales of the books, they really didn't need Dell. And at that time, the relationship ended. And then Western Publishing or Western Comics rebranded under the name of Gold Key Comics. And during this period of relationship, Dell produced also a number of horror books. They had Frankenstein and Dracula. But how were they able to do this? How were they able to distribute books that openly did not carry the CCA, that openly did not follow the rules that were established by the CCA? Well, it's very, very simple. They just didn't sign up for the code, and they were big enough that it didn't matter. And this was not necessarily a sign of rebellion. In Dell's case in particular, it was just total disdain for the comic publishers that had put the code together and ran with it. In fact, Dell's pledge that Dell's comics are good comics. That was their pledge was that they were actually stricter than the comics code. And during this period, they geared almost all of their books directly to the children market, and not necessarily the older pseudo-adolescent to adolescent market like other comics were slowly aligning themselves with. The owner of Dell at one time actually said he wanted his comics in the hands of people that couldn't read or were learning to read. And that's kind of where they set their bar, and their sales numbers accomplished it. But how were they able to accomplish this still without the CCA approval? Well, given their separation from the normal comic distribution avenues, Dell Publishing, having a long-standing history with pulp magazines, had their own distribution system. They had their own connections with all of the retailers. And so when the publisher that's behind Cupid's Diary and All Western Magazine and Public Enemy and All Detective Magazine says, hey, we're not going to follow the code, but you can trust us. Retailers listened because they were just that big, and they were selling copies. Like I said, 1953, per their own advertisement, 26 million copies a month. So by the dawn, I mean, and this is closing out the 60s, right? So we've got Gold Keys doing their own thing. And when they split, everything that had been associated with Dell, because Dell's still distributing Gold Key, they're just not getting most of the profits anymore, but Dell's happy. They're still making money. So when Gold Keys spun off, that association's just enough, and it carries right over with them. So as we close out the 60s, I've got a little bit of a cough here, so I'm going to take a quick intermission, and I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Try some new Minute Maid orange tangerine. It's got calcium.
Then I'm not drinking it.
Oh, no, it's sweet. You'll like it.
I don't believe you.
Well, then who would you believe?
I don't know, Robert Loggia. Whoa, Robert Loggia.
Billy, your mother's right. New Minute Maid orange tangerine tastes great. It's got as much calcium as milk.
If you say so, Mr. Loggia.
Yeah.
This is great.
Enjoy your breakfast.
New Minute Maid orange tangerine with calcium.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, by the close of the 60s and the dawn of that damnable decade of disco, the 1970s, the gauntlet had essentially been thrown down by the underground. Where the CCA had looked to restrict, limit, and control, the underground had sought to expand, extend, and express every avenue of creative freedom. For a large part, this meant being, as I said, offensive and pushing the limits beyond anything that was socially acceptable for pure shock value. But there was also a great deal of experimentation in broadening the medium, and creatives were turning those dials up to 11. And thus enters Robert Crumb and Zap Comics. While there were many others that came before Crumb and Zap, Zap rightfully claims to be the underground book that broke through to a wider audience. Realistically, even a national appeal. It was beyond anything that had been seen before for a book to come out of nowhere and do what it did. Whereas before, local papers, college papers, regional pamphlets had done most of the work, Zap achieved more. And Zap achieved so much, and it exploded in popularity so fast that it was almost growing too fast for Crumb to handle it. And so after only a few issues, he started including other artists. And one of the other artists that he brought in, yet again, comes up, Gilbert Shelton. And with Gilbert's help, they begin to expand outward and even more titles. And at this time, Crumb's based in San Francisco. And before this, you had things going on all over. There was an Austin underground scene. There was a Chicago underground scene. Nashville had an underground scene. New York had a large underground scene. But with Zap exploding, San Francisco becomes the heart and the epicenter of this loose conglomeration of underground books. With this increase in popularity also came mainstream recognition, and it came from where art recognition usually comes from when it's coming out of the underground. At first, it was art museums. And so art museums and exhibition halls started doing exhibitions of some of these gentlemen's work. And as that underground art started to gain more of this mainstream recognition and public acknowledgement, more people are getting their eyes on it, interest and circulation only begins to grow. And this increased attention results in publications from the adult to the satire reaching out to some of these individuals and looking to get work done. This included Playboy and National Lampoon, for two in particular ones. And they wanted to publish excerpts. A lot of these artists refused blatantly. They had the opportunity to cash in, and they chose no, because it wasn't about just getting their work out there. It was about retaining the ownership of it and retaining the creative rights. So when you're talking about this, it's not the CCA started something, and they started something that was almost unheard of at the time. And it's artists were not only doing whatever they wanted to without restriction, they also were tasting what it meant to actually own their work for the first time in a long time. Now that was true for some people. I mean, famously Alex Raymond of Flash Gordon fame and Jungle Jim, and of course Hal Foster owned a little bit of all of Prince Valiant. But for a large number of the artists that were working in comic strips and comics at the time, they didn't necessarily own anything they were done or doing. So enter Wally Wood yet again. As the underground is reaching these heights, something kind of strange happens, and that's the United States military approaches Wally Wood to do a book that can be distributed on army bases. And so he does Cannon, which is salacious. It's got nudity. It's got extreme violence. Cannon's a brutal James Bond times 10. He wins the card game. He kills the bad guy. He beds the girl 3 times before the end of the book. And that took off. And so you've got now this underground vibe that's more refined, because Wood's the one handling it, is now out there. And because it's going out to army bases and air bases and naval stations, it's going worldwide. And to this day, you can find early 70s copies of Wally Wood's Cannon in Italian, in Japanese, in German. It's just astounding. And these are original publications, because they would print them in the native language and send some in English and some in whatever language and ship them out. I do actually own a copy of Canon number 4 in Italian, but I could not find it, which speaks more for my lack of organization and or the immense volume of books I own and probably need to thin down. So during the same time, though, is where Vaughn Bodie pops up again and his Cheech Wizard. I always love that "suck my turnip," man. That's just such a great line. But we also have Stan Lee popping back up at this time, and never one to monetize anything he possibly could. Stan moved to try to legitimize a little bit of the movement. In his words, in the words as anybody that he approached, he was looking to make tons of money for Marvel and screw over some artists. But it was ironically too, because these guys are the hot commodity that was created by the CCA that Atlas and Timely had actually, which is the precursing companies to Marvel, had actually forced and pushed. So he created the comics book, and the comics book uses the X. And one of the things that was traditional throughout all of this was that the comics went from the underground would use the X, and because the X had come to be associated with the salacious, the lewd, the lascivious, that which was not allowed in polite company, and they relished in it. And now it's been fully marketed. Now it's right there. It's a Marvel comic book, and artists submitted to them, and they got paid, and it sold for a little bit, but it was a short run, and it didn't really last, and it didn't have any legs. And while the vast majority of these underground books on this point were poignant in their focus on sex, drugs, more sex, loose morality, and generally just overall socially depraved topics. Oh yeah, did I mention sex? It was the early 70s that really started seeing the variety break away from that debauchery that had been born from, right? I mean, it's coming into its adolescence now. It's maturing a little bit. And so what you did is you had a new generation of creatives, and they were looking at both what was before the CCA with what EC was doing, and then they were looking at what the underground had responded with. And so following in tone with both the style of the classic EC comics and in many ways the spirit of what the underground had done, especially the things that had promoted the hysteria that resulted in the CCA, underground horror books began to flourish. Skull and Up from the Deep by, again, our friend Shelton's Ripoff Press in 1970 and 1971, respectively, emerged to high acclaim. But not everything now was centered out of California. And one book of particular note emerged, of all places, out of Wisconsin, and exploded a cultural monster. And from Death Rattle, which was produced by Kitchen Sink Press's owner, Dennis Kitchen, had probably arguably the largest cultural impact. This particular issue specifically carried a story by Tim Boxell called Defiled. And a young man in the Midwest got his hands on that when he was an adolescent and read it and described it as something perfectly disgusting. And that man was Dan O'Bannon. And a sequence from that very story would in turn inspire him writing the famous chestburster scene for the original Alien. So that's kind of the absolute crescendo of cultural mainstream, is you inspired a guy that wrote a movie that was directed by Ridley Scott that hit the box office huge, and still has massive cultural relevance to this day. But as is often the case, all good things must eventually come to an end. And by this point in the mid to late 70s, that creative explosion that had carried underground comics from the back alley corners, like the former Tijuana Bibles, it brought them all the way to the front door of everybody that had them. And by this point, Art Spielman put it probably best when he said what had seemed like a revolution simply deflated into a lifestyle. And the stereotypes mentioned earlier were, to his point, were incredible. It's incredibly accurate. Everything was about basically sex and dope, and it became repetitive. It just became a repetitive chorus. And smaller indies started breaking off, but for the most part, sales started to dip. The wave had reached its high water mark, so to speak. So, but as that slowdown happened, these indie books they're still bursting at the seams from everywhere, just not with the gusto or the panache that had been done for the previous 20 years. Artists had Xeroxed and stapled bootlegs copies of their book, where they're getting handsomely rewarded now for paychecks from magazines, from comic book publishers. Even newspapers were hiring them to do sketches and blips and cartoons and panels. But so how did the underground react to the CCA? Well, they ignored it and they did their own thing. And while it took time and a shit ton of effort, with little or no help from anybody that really mattered, and a shit ton of pain along the way, each of those independent creators creatively produced something so amazing it culturally forced its way across the demarcation line that had artificially been created. Barriers, as they say, cannot stop an idea. And I think to that end, I'd like to play another clip from Vaughn Bodie's 1974 interview to kind of hit that point home.
But he can censor me. Otherwise, I won't work. I wouldn't care. I'd give up my artwork, or I'd give up all my paying jobs if I were censored. Because that's the one thing that stopped me. Stan Lee offered me a job, offered me a series, and I told him that I couldn't do it. Mainly because he took my rights, because I didn't mind mellowing my work, but also because of the very, very heavy comics.
So there you go. I think that sums it up. And while this is not the end of the underground comic scene, as the later 70s and especially the early 80s would see a different kind of rebirth, but that's a different story for another day. So to recap, was the Comics Code Authority responsible for the underground and independent comic revolution? Would it still have occurred had extra market forces imposed restrictions on the creative endeavors of artists? Would comics have ever recovered from whatever limitations would have been put into place had the industry not set their own rules? We'll never know. But I can leave you with this, and this is the wisdom of Dr. Peter Venkman. Call it fate, call it luck, call it karma. I believe that everything happens for a reason. Thank you, everybody, for spending some time with me in the gutter. Have a good evening.
This is blood for blood and by the gallons. This is the old days, man, the bad days, the all or nothing days. They're back. There's no choices left.
You're still here? It's over. Go home.